The chill in the air was the first thing I noticed as I stood before the abandoned St. Mercy Hospital. The building loomed in the twilight, its windows dark and empty, like eyes watching my every move. I, Sarah Thompson, was here to uncover the secrets buried within its decaying walls. The stories of unethical experiments and tragic fires that left spirits restless had always intrigued me. Now, armed with my camera and flashlight, I was ready to face whatever haunted this forsaken place. Pushing open the creaking front door, I was greeted by a musty smell that hinted at years of neglect. The lobby was a desolate expanse, littered with debris and broken furniture. My footsteps echoed ominously as I made my way down the main hallway, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness. It didn't take long before I sensed I wasn't alone. Whispers, faint and indistinct, seemed to drift from the shadows. I paused, heart pounding, and strained to listen. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if warning me to turn back. But I pressed on, curiosity outweighing my fear. As I explored deeper into the hospital, I felt a sudden drop in temperature. My breath misted in the cold air, and I shivered despite my thick jacket. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadowy figure standing at the end of the corridor. It was tall and dark, with an aura of sadness that seemed to fill the space around it. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to glide toward me, its form becoming more defined with each step. I could see now that it was a man in a hospital gown, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes, hollow and lifeless, seemed to bore into mine. Panic surged through me, and I took a step back, nearly tripping over a fallen chair. As the apparition drew closer, it reached out a hand, its fingers thin and bony. I felt a cold, oppressive presence engulf me, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, the figure vanished, leaving me gasping for air and shaking with terror. Gathering my wits, I moved forward, determined to uncover the truth. I entered what appeared to be a patient ward. The beds were still neatly made, as if waiting for occupants who would never return. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, but I couldn't make out any words. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught my eye. Turning quickly, I saw the translucent form of a nurse, her expression one of sorrow and regret. She glided through the ward, checking on invisible patients. I watched in awe and horror as she tended to the beds, her touch gentle but futile. I followed the ghostly nurse, drawn by an inexplicable compulsion. She led me to a room at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. Pushing it open, I was met with a sight that made my blood run cold. There, lying on the bed, was the apparition of a young girl. Her eyes were wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. The nurse hovered over her, unable to soothe her torment. My heart ached for the girl, but before I could move closer, the nurse turned to face me. Her eyes locked onto mine, filled with a desperate plea for help. I wanted to reach out, to offer some comfort, but fear rooted me to the spot. Then, in an instant, both apparitions vanished, leaving the room eerily quiet. I stumbled back into the hallway, my mind reeling from what I'd seen. The whispers grew louder, now accompanied by the distant sound of footsteps. I turned, my flashlight beam bouncing off the walls, but saw nothing. My pulse quickened as the footsteps drew nearer, echoing through the empty corridors. Before I could react, a shadowy figure lunged out of the darkness, and everything went black. The last thing I heard was the whispering voices merging into a single, chilling phrase, "You shouldn't have come here." I woke up on the cold, hard floor of the hospital, the taste of dust and fear lingering in my mouth. My head throbbed, and I struggled to piece together what had happened. The last thing I remembered was the shadowy figure lunging at me. How long had I been unconscious? Minutes? Hours? I had no way of knowing. Groggily, I pushed myself to my feet and grabbed my flashlight, which thankfully still worked. Its beam cut through the darkness, revealing the same eerie corridor where I had encountered the ghostly nurse and the terrified girl. The air felt even colder now, and an unsettling silence filled the space around me. Suddenly, the lights above me flickered on and off, casting unsettling shadows on the walls. My heart raced as I looked around, trying to make sense of my surroundings. The hospital seemed to come alive with an eerie energy, the flickering lights playing tricks on my eyes. I could swear I saw shadowy figures moving just beyond the edges of the light, but every time I turned to look, they were gone. Determined to keep moving, I made my way down the hallway, my footsteps echoing loudly in the otherwise silent building. As I passed by a series of closed doors, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak and groan of the old hospital sent shivers down my spine. Without warning, a loud burst of static erupted from the intercom system, causing me to jump. The garbled noise was accompanied by faint, disjointed voices, as if the hospital's PA system had come to life on its own. I tried to make out what the voices were saying, but it was impossible to discern any clear words. The unsettling cacophony only heightened my sense of dread. I continued down the hallway, reaching what appeared to be the hospital's main operating theater. The large room was filled with outdated medical equipment, much of it covered in dust and cobwebs. As I stepped inside, the overhead lights flickered erratically, casting a strobe-like effect that made the room feel even more disorienting. Suddenly, the medical machines began to hum to life, one by one. Monitors beeped, and the operating table's mechanical arms moved as if guided by unseen hands. My heart pounded as I watched in horror, unable to comprehend what was happening. It was as if the hospital itself was trying to communicate with me, to show me something important. The intercom crackled again, and this time, a faint voice broke through the static. "Help us." The words were barely audible, but they sent a chill down my spine. I turned toward the source of the voice, my flashlight beam illuminating a dusty corner of the room where an old medical file cabinet stood. I approached the cabinet cautiously, feeling a strange compulsion to open it. My fingers trembled as I pulled open the drawers, revealing stacks of old, dusty patient files. The records were yellowed with age, their edges frayed. I began to leaf through them, my eyes scanning the pages for any clues. One file in particular caught my eye. It belonged to a patient named Emily Lawson, admitted to St. Mercy Hospital in 1948. The details of her treatment were horrifying unethical experiments, isolation, and severe mistreatment. My stomach churned as I read about the cruel procedures she had endured, and I understood why her spirit might still haunt this place. As I delved deeper into the file, the lights flickered more violently, and the medical machine's noises grew louder, almost deafening. The intercom static reached a fever pitch, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if the hospital was reacting to my discovery, trying to push me away. Before I could process what I had read, the door to the operating theater slammed shut behind me with a thunderous bang. I spun around, my flashlight beam darting across the room. The shadowy figure from before stood in the doorway, its form more defined now. It was the same man in the hospital gown, his eyes hollow and accusing. He began to move toward me, his footsteps silent but purposeful. My heart raced, and I backed away, my mind screaming for me to run. The machines around me blared their alarms, and the lights flickered in a maddening rhythm. Panic surged through me as the figure closed the distance, its cold, lifeless eyes fixed on mine. In a desperate bid to escape, I turned and ran toward the only other exit, a door at the far end of the room. I could feel the figure's presence right behind me, the air growing colder with each step. I reached the door and yanked it open, only to find myself face to face with another apparition-y nurse with a twisted, malevolent grin. Before I could react, the nurse's ghostly hand shot out, grabbing my wrist with an icy grip. I gasped, feeling a paralyzing cold spread through my arm. The room around me spun, the lights and sounds blending into a chaotic blur. The nurse's grip tightened, and I knew I had to escape or risk being trapped here forever. With all my strength, I wrenched my arm free and stumbled through the door, slamming it shut behind me. I found myself in a narrow hallway, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The footsteps and whispers grew louder, closing in from all sides. As I pressed forward, my flashlight flickered and then died, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my spare batteries, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The whispers grew louder, now accompanied by an unsettling growl that sent shivers down my spine. I managed to replace the batteries and turned the flashlight back on, its beam cutting through the thick darkness. Just as I started to feel a glimmer of hope, a hidden door in the wall slid open, revealing a dark, narrow passageway. The cold air that wafted out carried a sense of foreboding, but I had no other choice. The footsteps and growls were closing in, and I knew I had to move forward. I stepped into the passageway, the door sliding shut behind me with a final, ominous thud. The walls were damp and covered in mold, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. My flashlight flickered again, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. I moved cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. As I ventured deeper into the passage, the whispers grew more distinct, guiding me forward. The air grew colder, and I felt a sense of dread settle over me. I knew I was getting closer to the heart of the hospital's dark secrets. Suddenly, the passageway opened into a small, hidden room. My flashlight illuminated the disturbing sight of old, rusted medical equipment and stacks of dusty patient files. The room reeked of death and despair, and I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness. Before I could explore further, the hidden door behind me slammed shut, trapping me inside. Panic surged through me as I realized there was no way out. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and I knew I had stumbled upon something truly sinister. The room began to shake violently, and I felt a cold, oppressive presence envelop me. The ghostly apparitions of patients and staff appeared, their eyes filled with sorrow and anger. They reached out to me, their ghostly hands cold and unforgiving. Just as I thought I couldn't take any more, the walls around me began to close in, and the room grew darker. I was trapped, with no escape, and the malevolent spirits were closing in. The last thing I saw was the ghostly face of the doctor, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and rage. And then, everything went black. I woke up again, this time to complete and utter darkness. The air was thick with a musty, decaying smell that made it hard to breathe. My head throbbed with pain, and it took me a moment to remember where I was, St. Mercy Hospital, in a hidden room that seemed to be the epicenter of its haunting. I fumbled for my flashlight and clicked it on, the weak beam barely penetrating the gloom. The room was small, with walls covered in grime and dampness. The old medical equipment and patient files seemed to pulsate with a life of their own, the ghostly apparitions of the past still lingering in the air. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I needed to find a way out of here. I started to search the room methodically, looking for any clues or hidden exits. The walls were solid, but as I moved a stack of dusty patient files, I discovered a small crack in the wall behind them. I pressed against it, and to my surprise, a section of the wall swung open, revealing a narrow, hidden passageway. Without hesitation, I squeezed through the opening, my flashlight barely illuminating the cramped tunnel ahead. The air inside the passage was even colder, and I could hear the faint sound of dripping water echoing through the darkness. I moved forward cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the bowels of the hospital. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The walls seemed to close in on me, and the oppressive darkness was suffocating. I could hear faint whispers, just out of reach, urging me to turn back. After what felt like an eternity, I came to a fork in the tunnel. The left path was dark and foreboding, while the right path had a faint, eerie glow emanating from it. I chose the right path, drawn by the mysterious light. As I moved closer, the glow grew brighter, revealing a hidden room at the end of the passage. The room was filled with old, rusted medical equipment and jars containing who knows what preserved in formaldehyde. In the center of the room stood an operating table, covered in a thick layer of dust. I shuddered at the thought of the horrors that must have taken place here. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. On a shelf near the back of the room, I found a collection of old, dusty journals. I picked one up and began to read, my hands trembling. The journal belonged to Dr. William Harris, one of the hospital's former head doctors. His entries detailed the unethical experiments and treatments conducted on the patients, many of whom were subjected to unimaginable suffering. One entry in particular caught my eye. It described a secret room beneath the hospital, where the most disturbing experiments were carried out. The room was said to be accessible only through a hidden passageway, its entrance concealed behind a false wall. My heart raced as I realized I might be standing in that very room. Suddenly, the room began to shake violently, and I heard the sound of stone grinding against stone. I turned to see a hidden door in the far wall slowly opening, revealing another dark passageway. The cold, oppressive presence I had felt earlier returned, stronger than ever. I knew I had to keep moving forward. I stepped through the door and into the new passageway, my flashlight flickering ominously. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the walls were slick with moisture. As I ventured deeper, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be guiding me towards something, urging me onward. The passageway eventually opened into a large, cavernous room. In the center of the room stood a massive, ancient-looking door, its surface covered in strange symbols and markings. I approached the door cautiously, my flashlight beam dancing across the symbols. They seemed to pulsate with a dark energy, and I could feel a sense of dread wash over me. I reached out to touch the door, and as my fingers made contact with the cold, stone surface, the room was filled with a blinding light. I was thrown backward, landing hard on the damp floor. When I looked up, the door was glowing brightly, and the symbols seemed to come to life, swirling and shifting before my eyes. The light began to fade, and the door slowly creaked open, revealing a hidden chamber beyond. The air inside the chamber was even colder, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. I stood up, my legs trembling, and stepped through the doorway. The chamber was filled with rows of old, metal beds, each one occupied by a ghostly figure. The spirits of former patients lay motionless, their eyes closed, their faces twisted in expressions of pain and suffering. I felt a wave of sorrow wash over me, and I knew that these were the souls trapped by the hospital's dark past. As I moved through the chamber, the ghostly figures began to stir. Their eyes opened, and they turned to look at me, their expressions filled with a mixture of hope and despair. I could hear their whispers, pleading for release, begging for help. Suddenly, a cold, malevolent presence filled the room. I turned to see the ghostly figure of Dr. Harris standing at the far end of the chamber, his eyes burning with anger and hatred. He began to move toward me, his form becoming more solid with each step. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as the spirits of the patients cried out for help. I knew I had to find a way to free them, to break the hold that Dr. Harris had over this place. Just as Dr. Harris reached out to grab me, the floor beneath me gave way, and I was plunged into darkness. I fell through the void, the cold air rushing past me, and landed hard on a stone floor below. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I lay there, gasping for breath. As I struggled to get to my feet, I realized I was in another hidden room, this one even older and more sinister than the last. The walls were covered in strange, ancient symbols, and the air was thick with a sense of malevolence. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. In the center of the room stood a large, stone altar, its surface stained with dark, dried blood. The whispers were deafening now, and I could feel the weight of the spirits pressing down on me, their pain and suffering overwhelming. I knew I had to find a way to escape, to uncover the truth and free the trapped souls. But as I looked around the room, I realized that the only way out was through another hidden passage, concealed behind a heavy, iron door. With a sense of dread, I approached the door and pushed it open, stepping into the darkness beyond. The passage was narrow and winding, and I could feel the presence of the spirits all around me, urging me forward. As I moved deeper into the passage, the air grew colder, and the darkness seemed to close in around me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I knew I was getting closer to the heart of the hospital's dark secret. Finally, I reached the end of the passage and found myself standing before a massive, ancient door, its surface covered in the same strange symbols I had seen before. I took a deep breath and reached out to touch the door, my fingers trembling. As I made contact with the cold, stone surface, the door began to glow, and I felt a surge of energy wash over me. The whispers reached a fever pitch, and the air crackled with a dark, malevolent power. And then, with a deafening roar, the door burst open, revealing a hidden chamber beyond. In the center of the chamber stood a figure shrouded in darkness, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. I could feel the weight of its gaze, and I knew that I had finally come face to face with the source of the hospital's haunting. The figure began to move toward me, its presence overwhelming and suffocating. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest, knowing that I was about to uncover the darkest secret of St. Mercy Hospital. And then, just as the figure reached out to touch me, everything went black. The oppressive darkness gave way to a dim, eerie light, revealing the hidden chamber I had stumbled into. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the room, my flashlight's beam dancing over the ancient stone walls covered in cryptic symbols. I felt a chill run down my spine as I took in the sight of old patient files stacked haphazardly on dusty shelves and scattered across the floor. Pushing down my fear, I knew I had to find answers. The spirits I'd encountered, the oppressive presence that seemed to control this place, it all pointed to something sinister hidden within these records. I picked up the nearest file, its yellowed pages crackling under my touch. The name on the file read Emily Lawson, the same name I had seen before. With a deep breath, I began to read. The details of Emily's treatment were horrific. She had been subjected to countless experiments, each more unethical than the last. Electroshock therapy, lobotomies, and experimental drugs, all in the name of science, or so the records claimed. My stomach turned as I read about her suffering, her pleas for mercy ignored by the doctors who saw her as nothing more than a test subject. Page after page, the stories were the same. Patients brought in for minor ailments or mental health issues were transformed into living nightmares by the so-called treatments they received. The doctors responsible were meticulous in their notes, detailing each step of their procedures with a cold, clinical detachment that made my blood boil. As I dug deeper into the files, I found one that stood out. It was the diary of Dr. William Harris, the former head doctor whose ghostly apparition had haunted me earlier. My hands trembled as I opened the diary, the first entry dated back to 1945. Dr. Harris wrote about his initial intentions, claiming he wanted to push the boundaries of medical science to save lives. But as the entries continued, it became clear that his ambition had turned into obsession. He described the patients as necessary sacrifices and justified his cruel methods as the price of progress. The diary detailed his descent into madness, as he became more consumed by his experiments and less concerned with the lives he was destroying. One entry in particular caught my eye. It spoke of a hidden room beneath the hospital, a place where the most horrific experiments were conducted away from prying eyes. Dr. Harris believed this room held the key to unlocking untold medical advancements, even if it meant damning the souls of those who suffered within its walls. My hands were shaking as I read the final entries. Dr. Harris had begun to feel the presence of the very spirits he had tormented. His writing grew frantic, describing nightmares and ghostly apparitions that tormented him day and night. In his last entry, he confessed to sealing the room and vowing never to return, but it was clear he knew he was beyond redemption. The room began to shake violently, snapping me out of my horrified reverie. The files and shelves rattled, and the air grew colder, thick with an oppressive energy. The light flickered, and I felt a malevolent presence growing stronger. I turned to see the ghostly figure of Dr. Harris materializing before me, his eyes burning with a mixture of rage and regret. "You shouldn't be here," he hissed, his voice echoing through the chamber. I backed away, my heart pounding. "I need to know the truth," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "The truth will damn you," he replied, stepping closer. "Just as it damned me." His form grew more solid, the cold air around him becoming suffocating. I could feel his anger, his torment, pressing down on me like a physical weight. The spirits of the patients began to appear around him, their eyes filled with sorrow and accusation. They reached out to me, their ghostly hands cold and unforgiving. "I have to free them," I said, more to myself than to him. "I have to make this right." Dr. Harris's ghostly form loomed over me, his face contorted with rage. "You cannot change what has been done," he snarled. "You will only join them." The room shook harder, the walls seeming to close in on us. I could hear the anguished cries of the patients, their suffering echoing through the chamber. The air was thick with despair, and I felt my own strength waning. Desperate, I clutched the diary to my chest and looked around for an escape. The walls were covered in the same strange symbols I had seen before, pulsing with a dark energy. I realized these symbols were the key, a way to break the hold Dr. Harris had over this place. Summoning every ounce of courage, I began to recite the symbols out loud, hoping to disrupt the dark energy that bound the spirits here. The room shook even more violently, and the ghostly figures writhed in pain, their forms flickering in and out of existence. Dr. Harris let out a deafening roar, his form dissolving into a swirling mass of darkness. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, and the oppressive energy in the room began to lift. I could feel the spirit's presence weakening, their cries growing fainter. Just as I thought I was breaking through, the ground beneath me gave way, and I fell into a hidden pit. The darkness swallowed me, and I landed hard on a cold, stone floor below. Pain shot through my body, and I struggled to catch my breath. I pushed myself up from the cold stone floor, every bone in my body aching from the fall. My flashlight was miraculously still working, its beam cutting through the thick darkness that surrounded me. The whispers had subsided to a low murmur, but the oppressive feeling of being watched remained. I had to keep moving, had to uncover the secrets that kept this place locked in perpetual torment. I stumbled forward, the narrow passageway opening up into a larger, dimly lit ward. The air here was thick with the scent of antiseptic and decay. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw them, ghostly figures of doctors and nurses moving silently among the beds. They seemed to be performing their rounds, checking on patients who no longer existed. I watched, both horrified and fascinated, as the phantom caretakers went about their tasks. Some moved with a purposeful grace, their faces calm and focused. Others were less composed, their expressions twisted in pain and anger. It was clear that, in life, these spirits had been just as varied as the living staff of any hospital. Now, in death, they were trapped in a never-ending cycle of their former duties. One nurse, her form shimmering faintly, approached a bed near me. Her face was kind, her eyes soft with compassion. She reached out to smooth the sheets, her ghostly hand passing through the fabric. She looked up and met my gaze, her expression shifting to one of recognition and sorrow. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice echoing in the stillness. "I need to help them," I replied, my voice trembling. I need to free them. She nodded slowly, her eyes filled with an ancient sadness. There is a way, but it is not without danger. The spirits here are not all like me. Some have been consumed by their suffering and rage. They will not welcome your presence. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Tell me what I need to do. The nurse's form flickered, and she glanced around nervously. You must find the heart of this place, where the darkest secrets are kept. Only there can you break the hold that binds us. But be warned, the spirits guarding it will not let you pass easily. I nodded, determination hardening my resolve. Thank you. I will find a way. Before she could respond, a loud crash echoed through the ward, and the air grew thick with a malevolent energy. The kind nurse vanished, her form dissolving into the shadows. I spun around, my flashlight beam darting across the room. The malevolent spirits were closing in, their eyes burning with hatred. They moved toward me, their faces twisted in fury and pain. I could feel their anger, their suffering, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing colder with each step. One of the spirits, a doctor with a malevolent grin, lunged at me. I stumbled backward, barely avoiding his grasp. His hand passed through the space where I had been, leaving a trail of cold air in its wake. The other spirits followed suit, their movements frantic and aggressive. I ran, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I navigated the twisting corridors. The malevolent spirits were right behind me, their whispers now a cacophony of rage and despair. I could feel their cold breath on my neck, their hands grasping at my clothing. Desperation drove me forward, my mind racing for a way to escape. I rounded a corner and saw a heavy iron door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, and beyond it, I glimpsed the familiar setting of the psychiatric wing. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning with the effort. Just as I reached the door, a ghostly hand grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around. The malevolent doctor stood before me, his eyes filled with a dark, unnatural light. You cannot leave, he hissed. You belong to us now. With a surge of adrenaline, I wrenched free from his grasp and threw myself through the door. I slammed it shut behind me, the heavy iron barrier providing a momentary respite from the pursuing spirits. I leaned against it, gasping for breath, my heart racing. The psychiatric wing was even more unnerving than the rest of the hospital. The padded walls and empty restraints told stories of their own, of patients who had been subjected to unspeakable treatments. The air was thick with a sense of lingering madness and despair. I moved cautiously through the ward, my flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The whispers were still present, but they had changed. Now, they seemed to be urging me forward, guiding me towards something deeper within the hospital. Suddenly, I heard a low, guttural growl behind me. I turned to see a malevolent spirit, its form barely human, emerging from the shadows. Its eyes glowed with a dark, hungry light, and it moved toward me with a predatory grace. I backed away, my mind racing for a way out. The spirit lunged at me, its ghostly hands reaching for my throat. I ducked and ran, my flashlight beam dancing wildly as I navigated the maze of padded rooms and narrow corridors. The malevolent presence was right behind me, its growls growing louder and more menacing. Just as I thought I was out of options, I saw a door at the end of the corridor. It was marked with a faded sign, Research Wing. I knew that this was where I needed to go, where the darkest secrets of St. Mercy Hospital were kept. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me. The growls and whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence. I found myself in a long, dimly lit hallway. The door to the psychiatric wing creaked open with a reluctant groan, as if even it wanted to warn me away. The air inside was colder, and the sense of despair was palpable. I stepped inside, the door closing behind me with a final, echoing thud. My flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, revealing padded walls, empty restraints, and discarded medical equipment. This was where the hospital's most vulnerable patients had been brought, where their suffering had been most profound. The whispers that had been guiding me grew louder, more distinct, as if the spirits were desperate for me to understand their pain. I moved cautiously down the corridor, my heart pounding in my chest. The padded rooms were a stark reminder of the cruelty that had taken place here. I could almost hear the echoes of past screams, the desperate pleas for mercy. I paused at the first open door, peering inside. The room was small and claustrophobic, its walls covered in padded fabric to prevent self-harm. The restraints on the bed were still fastened, as if waiting for a patient who would never return. I shuddered at the thought of the people who had been trapped here, subjected to unimaginable horrors in the name of treatment. As I continued down the hallway, the oppressive feeling of being watched intensified. The shadows seemed to move of their own accord, and the air grew colder with each step. I knew I was not alone. The spirits of former patients lingered here, their anguish and rage a tangible presence. I turned a corner and found myself in a larger room, its walls lined with shelves of old medical journals and equipment. In the center of the room stood a table, and on it, a thick, leather-bound journal. I approached it cautiously, my flashlight illuminating the cover. It was labeled Dr. William Harris Research Journal. My heart raced as I opened the journal, the pages yellowed with age. Dr. Harris's meticulous handwriting detailed the unethical treatments and experiments conducted on psychiatric patients. His obsession with pushing the boundaries of medical science had led him to perform lobotomies, electroshock therapy, and other horrific procedures without consent. Each entry was a testament to his growing madness, his descent into a dark obsession that had ultimately consumed him. One entry in particular caught my attention. It described a patient named Margaret, a young woman who had been admitted for severe depression. Dr. Harris had subjected her to a series of brutal experiments, believing he could cure her. Instead, he had driven her to the brink of madness. Her spirit, he wrote, was the key to understanding the true nature of the human mind. As I read, the air around me grew colder, and I felt a presence in the room. I looked up and saw the ghostly figure of Margaret standing before me, her eyes filled with sorrow and pain. She reached out a hand, her ghostly fingers brushing against the journal. "You must end this," she whispered, her voice echoing in the stillness. "You must confront him." I nodded, feeling a surge of determination. I had to confront Dr. Harris's spirit and put an end to the suffering he had caused. Margaret's ghostly form faded, but her presence lingered, guiding me forward. I continued to explore the psychiatric wing, moving from room to room. The padded walls and restraints were a stark reminder of the cruelty that had taken place here. The whispers of the spirits grew louder, more urgent, as if they were urging me to hurry. I could feel their pain, their desperate need for release. In one room, I found a collection of old photographs and patient records. The faces of the patients stared back at me, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. I realized that these were the people who had suffered the most at Dr. Harris's hands, the ones who had been subjected to his most brutal experiments. I picked up one of the records and began to read. It detailed the treatment of a patient named Robert, who had been admitted for schizophrenia. Dr. Harris had subjected him to a series of electroshock treatments, believing he could shock the illness out of him. The records described how Robert had deteriorated, his mind and body broken by the relentless treatments. As I read, the air around me grew colder, and I felt a malevolent presence closing in. I looked up to see the ghostly figure of Dr. Harris standing in the doorway, his eyes burning with a dark, unnatural light. "You have no right to be here," he hissed, his voice filled with rage. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. "I have to stop this," I said, my voice trembling. I have to free them. Dr. Harris's form grew more solid, his anger radiating off him in waves. You cannot change what has been done, he snarled. You will only join them. The room began to shake violently, and I could feel the spirits of the patients closing in, their pain and anger a tangible force. The walls seemed to close in on me, and the air grew thick with a sense of impending doom. I knew I had to confront Dr. Harris, to break the hold he had over this place. With a surge of determination, I stepped forward, holding the journal out in front of me like a shield. I know what you did, I said, my voice stronger now. I know the truth. Dr. Harris's eyes widened, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of fear. But then his expression hardened, and he lunged at me, his ghostly form passing through the air with a chilling speed. I dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding his grasp. The spirits of the patients began to cry out, their voices rising in a deafening chorus of anguish and rage. I knew I had to find a way to break Dr. Harris's hold over the spirits, to free them from their torment. The journal held the key, I was sure of it. But as I flipped through the pages, my hands shaking, I couldn't find the answer. The room shook harder, and I felt the floor beneath me begin to crack. Just as Dr. Harris reached out to grab me again, I stumbled upon a final entry in the journal. It described a ritual, a way to confront the spirits and free them from their torment. The instructions were vague, but it was my only hope. I began to recite the words, my voice trembling but growing stronger with each syllable. The room grew colder, and the air crackled with a dark energy. Dr. Harris's form flickered, and he let out a deafening roar. The spirits of the patients began to wail, their voices merging into a single, anguished cry. I could feel the darkness closing in, but I pressed on, determined to see the ritual through. And then, just as I finished the final words, the ground beneath me gave way, and I was plunged into darkness. I fell through the void, the cold air rushing past me, and landed hard on a cold, stone floor below. Pain shot through my body, and I struggled to catch my breath. As I looked up, I saw a new passageway before me, its entrance concealed behind a heavy iron door. The whispers returned, urging me to continue. The malevolent presence I had felt earlier was stronger than ever, and I knew I was getting closer to the heart of the hospital's dark secret. Gathering my strength, I pushed open the iron door and stepped into the darkness beyond, knowing that the final confrontation with Dr. Harris awaited me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the weight of the spirits pressing down on me, their pain and suffering overwhelming. The ghostly apparition of Dr. Harris appeared before me, his eyes burning with a dark, unnatural light. "You cannot escape," he snarled. "You belong to me." I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the battle ahead. "I will free them," I said, my voice steady. "I will end this." Dr. Harris's ghostly form lunged at me, his eyes burning with an unnatural, malevolent light. I dodged to the side, my heart pounding in my chest, and stumbled into the darkness of the passageway. The weight of the hospital's dark past seemed to press down on me, each step heavier than the last. The whispers of the spirits grew louder, their cries of anguish and desperation filling my ears. I knew that I was nearing the end, but the final confrontation with Dr. Harris awaited. I clutched the journal tightly, the key to breaking the hold that Dr. Harris had over the hospital and freeing the trapped spirits. The passages I had read, the details of the ritual, echoed in my mind. I just had to hold on and see this through. I steeled myself, pushing forward into the heart of the hospital's darkness. The passage opened into a cavernous room, its walls lined with more of the strange, pulsating symbols I had seen before. In the center stood a large, ancient-looking altar, stained with dark, dried blood. Dr. Harris stood before it, his ghostly form more solid and imposing than ever. The malevolent energy radiating from him was almost suffocating. "You cannot escape," he hissed, his voice echoing through the chamber. "You belong to me, just like the others." I took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage. "I will free them," I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "I will end this." Dr. Harris let out a roar of rage and lunged at me again. I dodged, barely avoiding his grasp, and began to recite the ritual words I had memorized from the journal. The air around me crackled with dark energy, and the symbols on the walls began to glow brighter. The spirits of the patients appeared around the room, their ghostly forms flickering with pain and sorrow. They cried out, their voices merging into a deafening chorus that shook the very foundations of the hospital. I could feel their desperation, their need for release. Dr. Harris's form flickered, his rage growing as he tried to silence me. "You cannot break my hold," he screamed, his voice filled with fury. I continued the ritual, my voice growing stronger with each word. The symbols on the walls pulsed with a bright, blinding light, and the air crackled with energy. The spirits began to move toward Dr. Harris, their forms solidifying as they drew strength from the ritual. "You cannot win," Dr. Harris bellowed, his form distorting and flickering as the spirits closed in. I reached the final words of the ritual, my voice ringing out clear and strong. "In the name of those you have wronged, I command you to release them." The room shook violently, and a blinding light filled the chamber. The spirits surged forward, their forms merging into a single, powerful force. Dr. Harris let out a scream of pure rage and terror as the spirits engulfed him, their combined energy overwhelming his dark presence. The light grew brighter, and I could feel the hold that Dr. Harris had over the hospital breaking. The walls trembled, and the ground beneath me began to crack. The spirits, now free from their torment, let out a final, triumphant cry before dissipating into the light. The hospital started to collapse around me, the walls crumbling and the ground shaking violently. I turned and ran, the path I had taken to get here now a treacherous maze of falling debris and collapsing corridors. The whispers of the spirits had faded, replaced by the deafening roar of the hospital's destruction. I raced through the dark passageways, dodging falling beams and chunks of ceiling. The exit seemed impossibly far, but I pushed on, adrenaline driving me forward. As I reached the final corridor, the walls began to cave in, the ground splitting open beneath my feet. With a final burst of energy, I hurled myself through the doorway and into the open air. The hospital behind me crumbled, the ancient, cursed building finally succumbing to the weight of its dark history. I landed hard on the ground outside, gasping for breath, the roar of the collapsing hospital echoing in my ears. I looked back, watching as St. Mercy Hospital was swallowed by the earth, the last remnants of its malevolent presence disappearing into the rubble. The air was still, the oppressive weight of the spirit's suffering finally lifted. I lay there for a moment, catching my breath and letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. The spirits were free, and the dark history of St. Mercy Hospital was finally laid to rest. I knew that I had to share their story, to ensure that the world knew the truth about the horrors that had taken place within those walls. With a deep breath, I stood up, brushing the dust and debris from my clothes. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a warm, golden light over the landscape. It was a new day, a new beginning for the spirits who had been trapped for so long. I walked away from the ruins of St. Mercy Hospital, vowing to tell the world their story. The spirits had found peace, and it was my duty to ensure that their suffering was never forgotten. The haunting was over, but the memory of their pain and the strength of their triumph would live on. As I made my way back to civilization, I felt a sense of calm and determination settle over me. The darkness had been vanquished, and the spirits had been freed. It was time to move forward, to honor their memory and share the truth with the world. And as I walked, I could almost hear the faint, grateful whispers of the spirits, carried on the morning breeze.